Welcome to the next installment in our video lecture series here at Rutgers University for the online American Economic History course. And in this video lecture series, we're going to be going over Chapter 27 in your textbook, which the authors are Hughes and Kane, and the book is American Economic History. And we're going to take a look at the post-war economy, looking at after the end of World War II, issues that cropped up with the successful prosecution of the war. So one of the more important things that we're going to talk about is this Employment Act of 1946. What was the Employment Act of 1946? What were the aims of the Employment Act, and what the parties that were most involved in putting together this piece of legislation? What were the particular interests that were driving the Employment Act of 1946? Also, we just want to take a quick look at the types of economic growth and the level of inflation that occurred in the post-war economy. So one of the things that we consistently look at in this course is after there's a finishing of the war, what happens to GDP, unemployment, inflation, the deficit, etc. So just a general look at what happened to the economy post-World War II. Also, we'll take a little bit of a look at monetary and fiscal policy issues that cropped up in the post-World War II era. And in particular, we'll take a look at the changing role of deficits, what role deficits played prior to the Great Depression and World War II, and the role that they played after that changing role. And then finally, we'll take a look at some international organizations that were related to economic activity that cropped up after World War II and the impact of them on the economy in the United States. So make sure you remember something about this Employment Act of 1946. One thing that is oftentimes posited by historians, it is a remnant of the New Deal, that it was a quote-unquote New Deal device. And by New Deal, I'm talking about the programs that were put in place during the Great Depression. And I think this is quite erroneous, and your textbook agrees, the authors of the textbook agree, that it's not a vestige of the New Deal, because the impetus for this came from very different groups of individuals. A lot of this did not have to do with actually domestic issues. A lot of this had to do with our allies, the British. They were particularly interested that in the post-World War II era, that part of their negotiations for international finance and how the international financial world was going to be structured, the way it was being structured was very dependent upon the economy of the United States being strong. And they wanted to make sure that there were instruments in place to maintain, or there were specific government policies aimed at maintaining a high level of output and employment in the United States. The reason for this is because when we go on to the gold standard post-World War II, but basically what occurred is the dollar was the default world currency. And the issue that countries had was that if there was a cyclical downturn in the United States, if the United States ran into a recession, that they would end up having higher trade surpluses, which means that there would not be gold or dollars in essence, because dollar was backed by gold. So the dollar assets of those countries that were trading with the United States would go down, because historically whenever the United States moved into a recession, we would buy less things from other countries. So that would put a drain on dollar-based assets in those countries. All right. So what would happen is that if the United States moved into a recession, meant that these other countries would move into a recession after World War II. So the British very much wanted to have some type of protection, particularly codified in law, that the United States would actively, the federal government would be actively involved in the economy to maintain full employment, to maintain a growing economy. The reason why, as I said previously, that the British wanted this is that because with the United States being such an important economic power in the post-World War II world, that the fear was that the United States moved into a recession, it would drag all the other economies into a recession. So that would happen that if the international trade was based upon the dollar, if fewer dollars were flowing into those countries, less international trade would occur. So their fear was that with the United States moving into a recession or an economic downturn, it would pull the entire world economy into a recession. So they wanted protections codified in law that the United States would actively intervene in the economy to make sure that there was full employment in the United States. So make sure you're aware of the British impact on the Employment Act and the fact that the Employment Act, although it looks like it's a vestige of the New Deal, was very much related to world trade and the rebuilding of the world economy post-World War II, particularly the British. The British wanting some type of protections that would prevent the United States from moving into a prolonged recession. All right? And if you think about it also, that if the United States has a strong economy, they're going to be buying a lot of imports. So if the economy in the United States is strong, the demand for imports is strong, which means countries like Great Britain, France, etc., could earn dollars by the sale of products to the United States. So that was the main concern, that under the system, a U.S. recession would be exported to the rest of the world, and the Allies and the rest of the world were worried about this eventuality. So this was a good faith gesture to European allies. And here's the actual text. The Congress hereby declares that it is the continuing policy and responsibility of the federal government to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. So I want you to understand this is very important. This codifies in law that it is the federal government's policy and responsibility. It's the federal government's responsibility to actively intervene in the economy to make sure that the economy is growing and that we have full employment in the economy. This is a complete turnaround from the classical school of economics, which was a hands-off philosophy. That if things were going bad, if we moved into a recession, if you just left things alone, the recession eventually would correct itself, and the economy is actually better off, because anytime the government does get involved, classical economists believe that it ends up that intervention actually makes the economy worse off. So realize that this is a complete turnaround in economic thinking, and actually makes the federal government, and codifies in law that it's a responsibility. The federal government is responsible to promote maximum employment, production, and purchasing power. All right, this is a watershed event in economics in the United States, because previously it was thought that the government should have minimal intervention in the economy, and with the Employment Act it became the responsibility of the federal government to promote economic welfare, and it was the policy of the United States to maintain high employment, production, and purchasing power. All right, as I talked about previously, the view of the classical economists was counter to the intent of the Employment Act. Beforehand, it was basically the government was to keep its hands off the economy, to have a minimal involvement in the economy, and now with the Employment Act, it was the responsibility of the government. So I already talked to you about the classical economists, that they had a hands-off philosophy, that if the economy moved into a recession, it would correct itself eventually, while on the other hand, the Keynesians believe that the government should be involved in actively stimulating the economy. The Employment Act also came up with a few other things. Also remember the annual report of the President on the state of the economy. So this became part of the President's responsibilities, that he provide an annual report on the state of the economy, and it also created the Council of Economic Advisors. So it shows you also the importance of economics growing, particularly in public policy, in regards to managing the economy of the United States. Let's just take a few look at some indicators to try and see what happened. In particular, I want to compare when the war ended and then after the war, just to take a look at a few things. We can see that we have a short recession in 1946, where GDP actually decreases. All right. Notice that it's not due to personal consumption falling. Personal consumption actually increases during this time period. So from 45 to 46, we actually see a dramatic increase in personal consumption, but GDP falling, and that can be attributed to the fact that we're ramping down the war effort. The government purchases are falling quite dramatically. All right, so make sure you realize that we did move into a brief post-war recession in 1946. But this was mostly due to the dramatic decrease in government expenditures. Personal consumption actually increased during that time period. And it's quite a dramatic increase, about a 16% increase in personal consumption. The explanation as to why personal consumption would increase so dramatically is you have to remember during the war period that there was rationing that occurred, that individuals could only purchase a certain amount of goods. For example, at home I have a ration card from my father for sugar. And it was a booklet that had little stamps in it, and anytime you bought a certain amount of sugar, you had to rip out one of those stamps and give it to the person you were buying sugar from. Once you ran out of stamps, you couldn't buy any sugar. So a lot of personal items were rationed during that time period in order to keep a lid on inflation. Well, what you end up saying is that there's a lot of pent-up demand. People, once the war was over and these controls on prices and these quotas and the rationing that existed in the war were lifted, people, number one, had some savings left over because they couldn't purchase things, and two, they had demand for goods and services that they couldn't purchase during the war, and once these were lifted, you see a dramatic increase in personal consumption. So what was the net impact of that on inflation? As you can see, the first 2 years after the war, inflation takes off. 1945, the inflation rate's 2.3%. In 1946, it's 8.3%. And in 47, it's 14.4%. And a lot of economists attribute this to pent-up demand from consumers. You can see that consumer spending increases from 45 to 46, and again from 46 to 47. All right? So a lot of this oftentimes is attributed by economists of pent-up consumer demand was the driving force behind this. So that's what I want you to realize about the post-year wars, 46 and 47, that we do see a mild recession in 46, mostly due to the fact that government expenditures fell dramatically during this time period, but this was offset by a dramatic increase in personal consumption. Consumers had dramatic increases in personal consumption. The economic explanation as to why this dramatic increase in consumption is that, one, there was pent-up demand. Individuals were saving quite a bit during the war because they didn't have they just couldn't purchase things. There was a rationing system that was in place, and then once that rationing system was lifted, individuals had that demand that they hadn't satisfied in the war years, plus they had additional savings which they could tap to purchase things. And in response to that, what happened? That increase in demand for consumer goods caused the inflation increase to increased dramatically from 2.3% to 8.3 to 14.4. So you don't have to realize these actual numbers. I wouldn't expect anybody to remember the actual numbers, but if you realize that in the 2 years, 46 and 47, that there was a dramatic increase in the inflation rate attributable to consumer increase in personal consumption, that is the main point that I'm hoping that you will get from this. Then we can see the economy picks up from 46 to 47, and then in 48, and then you can see once again in 1949, the economy starts to stagnate. We see total GDP decreasing during the time period. All right, and we actually see a negative inflation rate. Prices actually fall by 1.2%. And then we start seeing the economy picking up again. If we look at in the early 50s, we see continual growth through the entire decade for GDP. GDP is increasing every single month. A little lull here in 53, 54, where there's a very small increase, but for every year after that, we see increases. So the 50s were a period of general economic growth in the United States. I would imagine, and I'm not that much of an actual historian, but this period here, 53, 54, I would imagine that the Korean War probably ended during this time period, right around 54. I'll have to double check and look at that. But without knowing the actual dates and seeing with the economy slowing down, I could see here in the 50s there was a dramatic increase in GDP, which would be attributable to an increase in government expenditures. And then when the economy starts to lag, I would imagine that could be attributable to when the Korean War actually ended and government expenditures fell. So I want you to realize that if you take a look at the 50s, except for 1951, and which would mark pressures increase in prices due to the outbreak of the Korean War, that prices were relatively stable in the 50s. Other than that 7.9% increase, the highest the inflation rate gets is in 1957 at 3.3%. So just realize that the decade of the 50s was marked by steady economic growth, steady growth in personal expenditures. You see personal expenditures increasing every year, so personal consumption going up. And it's a period where the inflation rate was relatively stable. All right, we'll take a look at how national income changes. And the other thing I want you to realize is just to take a look at the change in national income and the industry of origin. All right, so you can see that these are the ratios of spending from 1950 to 1945. You can see that during this time period, what happens, that government actually shrinks. In 45, it was $36.9 billion in government expenditures, and in 1950, this fell to 23.9. So realize that in the post-war era, there was a dramatic shrinkage in government expenditures. Where did we end up seeing great increases? The construction industry. So make sure you're aware of that in the post-World War II era, particularly 45 to 50, the industry that saw the highest rate of growth was construction. All right, this is the era of the great building boom in the United States, particularly building housing for returning veterans. All right, there's quite a few. If you look in this region, I don't know what town that you live in, but in some towns there are particular tracts of land that there are developments that have specific names, and they were all built in the right around 1950, and that was. That construction boom and building, not only businesses but also building homes was a major proportion of the increase in expenditures in the United States. So I want you to realize that in the post-war era, particularly 45 to 50, we see a dramatic decrease in the importance of government expenditures in the creation of national income. And this is offset mainly by the increase in contract construction. The construction industry dramatically increased, almost a threefold increase in national income that's accountable to construction. All right, so realize that the overview, post-war economy was healthy. Little government support. We see that the government is shrinking in size after the war and in the 50s. So we have the military shrinking. Also realize that some of these military contracts were long-term contracts. So the government signed a contract. If they signed a contract with you 45, it might go into 46. So realize that some of the contracts still had to be completed. So even though the war was over in 45, the impact of military spending on the economy continued into 1946. And there were some expenditures from demobilization. You have to demobilize the troops, you might shut down bases, etc. So there was additional expenditures that occurred after the war. So just after the war. So just realize that even though the war ended in May of 45, the impact, the spending impact of the war continued into 45 and into 46, mostly because some military contracts did not expire until 46, and then the process of demobilization required the government to have military expenditures, and also the Marshall Plan. Realize that the Marshall Plan was set up to assist Europe in rebuilding after World War II. It was partially, I'm trying to think of the best way to explain it. Partially altruistic in helping Europe rebuild in the aftermath of World War II, but it was also as semi-self-serving in the fact that individuals realized that if the economy of the United States were to be strong, you had to have strong economies in Europe. That if the economies in Europe were devastated for decades after the fact, we would be selling very few products to those European nations. So what we had to do is to rebuild those economies, and in portion to rebuild those economies because it rebuilt the market for our exports in those economies. So realize that the government expenditures fall by 40% in 1945 to 50, and the tax receipts remain relatively constant. So let's take a look at deficits. You can see that we had a huge deficit in 1945. $29 billion deficit against $41 billion in receipts. All right, and what you can see in the post-war era is that the deficits shrank in 46, and we still have a remnant of a deficit in 46. But in 47 and 48, we run a surplus. 49, we run a deficit. 54, a deficit, and 58. But for every other year in the 50s and going into the 60s, the beginning part of the 60s, we actually ran a surplus in government during that time period. All right, and also realize that the money supply was relatively constant. We don't see dramatic increases in the money supply. Although the money supply is increasing, it's increasing roughly in pace with the increase in GDP. All right, so we end up with budget surpluses, and they would have a slightly depressionary effect, because if you realize that if for example, if there was a $6 billion surplus, if you took that $6 billion surplus and spent it in the economy, GDP would have grown even more. So some people argue that those budget surpluses had a depressing effect on GDP. And we start seeing the money supply declining in 1949. And also realize that there was a Treasury-Fed Accord where basically the Fed agreed to purchase federal bonds at a certain rate to make sure interest rates didn't go up, but a portion of that meant that with the Fed purchasing these bonds, you ended up seeing the money supply increasing. So basically it was an agreement with the Fed, between the Fed and the Treasury, that if the Treasury couldn't sell bonds at a certain rate, the Fed agreed to buy those bonds to keep interest rates low. The issue with this is that what it does is it monetizes a portion of the debt. A portion of the debt is bought by the Fed, and the Fed ends up increasing the money supply because of that. All right, so deficits. So you have Cold War peacetime military expenditures, New Deal program. So surpluses, and it says deficits here, but make sure that surpluses sort of become the norm in the 50s. All right, surplus, and generally they follow the pattern that there's surpluses in expansionary periods and deficits during the recession. Realize that the Republicans during the Great Depression were of the classical school. They thought that you should leave the government should keep its hands off the economy, and the economy would eventually rebound. Wages, etc., everything would adjust to get us back to full employment, and that there were deficits in the economy in 54 and 58, but these deficits related to recessionary periods where expenditures went up and revenues declined. Internationally, we went on a system of fixed exchange rates. All right, so that meant that they did not float in the marketplace. They were not set by supply and demand forces, that the dollar was equal to a certain amount of pounds and it was fixed. It would not change. All right, and this was the traditional belief that it stabilized international transactions, and it does stabilize those international transactions. If the exchange rate today, for example, is £2 for every dollar, and a year from that is £2 for every dollar, there's no risk associated with fluctuations of exchange rates. So with that decrease in risk, there's no exchange rate risk. That means there's international transactions are less risky, and there will be more international transactions that occur because of the decrease or the non-existence of exchange rate risk. All right. Unfortunately, during the Great Crash, and then in 1933 during the Great Depression, there was a great undermining of the belief in the fixed exchange rate system. As a matter of fact, some people argue that the gold standard actually helped to make the Great Crash and the Great Depression even worse. Because what happened is that all these countries started devaluing their currencies against one another to try and increase imports, and then it ended up being a cycle where countries were devaluing versus another country, and it just going on and on. Bretton Woods. Make sure that you understand in the post-World War II world that there was an attempt to try and reorganize international markets and international finance after the upheaval of World War II. And remember the notion of fixed exchange rates. So the fixed exchange rates, and also they wanted to make sure that there were easy short-term capital movements, particularly to finance international trade. So if you needed to borrow money in order to buy if you were in Germany or Great Britain or France and you wanted to buy capital or consumer goods from the United States, that there were short-term loans were available in order to finance those international transactions. Also, increasing long-term international capital flows. So they looked at this from a short-term and a long-term perspective. They wanted to free up capital, short-term capital movements in order to finance international trade, and then they wanted to release and increase long-term international capital flows. For example, if you wanted to build structures in, let's say, France, if you wanted to build things, a bridge, etc., you wanted to have long-term international capital flows. So, for example, individuals in the United States could lend money to individuals in France in order to build up that infrastructure. Also wanted to lower tariffs and eliminate trade barriers. So the purpose of Bretton Woods was to try and facilitate international trade as much as possible, whether it was for short-term credit, long-term credit, lowering tariffs, and eliminating trade barriers, just straight-up trade barriers saying, well, you can't import this good into my country, you're not allowed. All right, so lowering tariffs to facilitate trade, but also eliminating trade barriers to facilitate international trade. Realize that the Bretton Woods system set up the International Monetary Fund, and that their responsibility was to set exchange rates, all right, and provide short-term credit for member nations. The United States was the largest subscriber. All right, individual countries could subscribe, and credit was provided to the International Monetary Fund. It was their job to set exchange rates, and then to set up short-term credits for member nations so they could borrow money. The World Bank was set up underneath the Bretton Woods system, and they were set up to lend long-term credit. So the IMF was set up for exchange rate purposes and short-term credit. The World Bank was set up for long-term credit, and it set up international trade, the International Trade Organization, as a body to mediate issues that came up with tariff issues. Marshall Plan is important because it gave capital aid to rebuild Europe and Europe and Japan. It was also offered to some of the communist nations, but the Soviet Union declined participation in the Marshall Plan. So it provided capital grants and lending to individuals so they could rebuild Europe and Japan. So provided resources, but it also coordinated plans to try and coordinate the recovery of those countries. Also, a common market developed, all right, mostly to combat the nationalism's role, all right. Much of the issues that came up in World War II were based on nationalist aims, so they were trying to combat a sort of a spirit of cooperation amongst European nations instead of competing with one another. For example, Benelux was set up. Benelux stands for BE, Belgium, NE, Netherlands, and Lux is for Luxembourg. So the Benelux nations is Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg, basically setting up a free trade zone between those three countries. Even to this day, it still exists. For example, I was recently in Europe, and you can get a Benelux tour rail pass, which gives you unlimited rail travel for 5 days between Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. It's a vestige of that Benelux. And also the European Economic Community, where instead of having individual trade zones for each country, you had one unified European trade zone. All right, and then here we have GDP, just to give you an indication of the growth of GDP. And you can see that the debt in 1945, it grows between 45 and 60, but as a percentage of the federal debt to GDP, even though the debt was growing, GDP was growing faster. So you can see that the debt as a percentage of GDP fell over that 15-year time period.